Watch your forward! Yo, man, my guns are firing.
April 14, 2004, a U.S. Marine patrol was ambushed in a narrow street in central Iraq. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops and RPGs began slamming around them from the windows. The Marines opened up with everything they had. 50 cal gunners mounted on top of the vehicles began hammering the sides of the buildings, trying to take out RPG teams before they could hit them again. Then suddenly a white sedan came speeding out of a nearby alleyway, heading straight towards the patrol. The car slammed into the lead vehicle, and as the Marines dismounted and moved forward to clear it, an insurgent jumped out screaming and tackled one of the lead Marines. As they struggled for control on the ground, the man reached into his vest and pulled the pin on a grenade. The Marine instantly realized what just happened and did the unthinkable to save his brothers. His split-second decision saved the men around him, but it cost him everything. April 14, 2004, Karabila, Iraq. 22-year-old Corporal Jason Dunham sat inside the lead Humvee of his patrol. He was the lead vehicle commander, watching the world through a curtain of dust and heat. His gunner hovering just above him manned the M2 Browning 50 cal machine gun, an ancient beast of war that could tear through walls and engines alike. Dunham was the kind of Marine every squad wanted leading them. He was calm, sharp, and always volunteered for point, the most dangerous position. Their convoy rolled through the town, 3 Humvees, each packed full of Marines. The 50 cal gunner Corporal Kelly Miller, positioned above Dunham's seat, kept his finger near the butterfly trigger, his barrel tracking the rooftops for any and all movement. They had made this exact patrol numerous times before, but today the streets were empty. No kids, no dogs, no chatter, just the hum of diesel and the sound of distant wind. The Marines immediately knew something was wrong. They were deep in insurgent country, a place where Al-Qaeda hid bombs under trash piles and waited for convoys to roll over them. The Marines scanned every doorway, every window, and every pile of debris. Suddenly, the lead vehicle came to a halt, causing the rest of the convoy behind it to do the same. A small group of locals had scattered up ahead. They quickly sprinted across the street and disappeared. A sure sign that the civilians in the area knew something the Marines didn't. They prepared themselves for a likely ambush ahead and continued moving forward. They made it just a few more feet forward and then all hell broke loose. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed through the air and slammed into the front of the convoy, detonating in a deafening fireball. The blast lifted the first Humvee, showering the street with dust and debris. Gunfire erupted from both sides, AK-47s and PKMs echoing off the concrete walls. The gunners simultaneously squeezed their triggers, unleashing the full fury of their 50 cals. The streets filled with thunder, that deep metallic roar of heavy machine gun fire that drowns out everything else around it. Chunks of walls exploded around them in the alleyway. Dust filled the air and casings poured down like brass rain. The enemy fire intensified, RPG trails cutting through smoke and snapping overhead. The convoy was pinned in place and trapped in a crossfire, but Dunham stayed exposed, directing fire, moving between vehicles under open sky. Rounds cracking around him, slamming into the Humvee's armor, but he ignored it. He was too busy keeping his men alive. The ambush had been sudden and violent. RPGs, small arms fire, and complete and total chaos in every direction. But within minutes, the Marines of Kilo Company had regained control. They got straight to work, responded to the ambush, and put the enemy down hard. They secured the area, checked casualties, and they began sweeping the perimeter for anyone trying to flee the scene. Then they got a call over the radio notifying them that insurgents likely responsible for the attack had just been seen loading into 2 white vehicles nearby and trying to flee the area. Dunham immediately ordered his men to pile back up in the vehicles and move forward to cut off the fleeing vehicles. He quickly grabbed Kelly Miller and William Byers, 2 riflemen under his command. They loaded up fast, Dunham taking point as the Humvees roared back onto the road. The Marines moved quickly, 3 vehicles fanning out through the narrow streets of Karabila, a small border town only a few miles from Syria. It was hostile territory, riddled with insurgent cells from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Ambushers, bomb makers, smugglers, they all lived here. Up ahead, Dunham quickly spotted one of the white sedans they were looking for. The lead Humvee quickly moved into position, blocking the road ahead. The sedan swerved and slammed into the front of the Marine vehicle and came to a screeching stop. Dunham was out of his Humvee in seconds. He signaled his team to cover the flanks, then approached the car from the driver's side, rifle at the ready. Inside were 4 men who appeared to be pretty badly banged up from the head-on collision, but he couldn't tell if they were armed, and rules of engagement meant he could not engage. So he ordered them out of the vehicle in Arabic, screaming at them to exit the vehicle slowly with their hands in the air. 3 of the men complied immediately, but the 4th didn't. The driver, later identified as an insurgent affiliated with Al-Qaeda, shoved his door open and lunged. He hit Dunham like a linebacker, driving him backwards into the dirt. The 2 men tumbled in the dirt, fists flying. Miller and Byers quickly rushed forward to help, but Dunham barked at them to stay back. Dunham was not only confident that he could handle this man on his own, but he also knew how fast an insurgent could pull a hidden pistol or a grenade, and he wanted to make sure his Marines were clear. The 2 rolled violently, Dunham trying to force the man's hands behind his back. He was still wearing his Kevlar helmet, chin strapped tight, and his rifle sling tangling the 2 men together. Then, through the chaos, a faint sound, the metallic click of a pin being pulled. The man had armed an M67 fragmentation grenade, small but deadly enough to kill everyone within 15 feet. There was no time to run, no time to think. In one motion, Dunham screamed grenade and pushed the insurgent away. He then tore off his helmet and threw his body over the grenade, pressing the helmet against the ground, his torso sealing it off from the Marines around him. The blast tore through the street, muffled by the helmet and by his body. Miller and Byers fell backwards, rattled by the explosion. Their ears rang, but they were unharmed. When the smoke cleared and they came back to their senses, they saw Dunham laying face down, motionless. His uniform shredded, the ground blackened beneath him. He had absorbed the full force of the grenade. The attacker was dead, and his Marines were alive. The squad's medic sprinted to Dunham's side. He was still breathing, shallow and broken, but breathing. His helmet had been torn apart, the Kevlar shredded by shrapnel, but it had done exactly what he'd meant it to. It had bought his men their lives. The Marines carried him back to the Humvee, their hands slick with blood. Dunham drifted in and out, mumbling his words, drowned by the roar of the engine, as the Humvee accelerated back towards Camp Husabov, the nearest aid station. They arrived at the aid station in record time. Corpsmen met them at the gate, loading Dunham onto a stretcher. He was still breathing, still fighting. They cut away his gear, wrapped the wounds, pumped him full of fluids, and radioed for a Black Hawk medevac. The helicopter touched down in a storm of dust and rotor wash. The Marines watched silently as their squad leader was loaded inside. He was flown first to Al Asad Air Base, then on to Baghdad, where doctors stabilized him for transport to Regional Medical Center in Germany. From there, he was flown across the Atlantic to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. His injuries were catastrophic. The blast had caused severe trauma to his brain and upper body. He was placed in a medically induced coma to prevent further swelling. The doctors didn't expect him to ever wake up. The Marine Corps immediately got a hold of his parents and arranged for transport to get them to the hospital as fast as possible. When they arrived at Bethesda, Marines in dress blues escorted them to the intensive care unit, where they were able to say their goodbyes to their beloved son. And on April 22nd, 2004, Corporal Jason Lee Dunham passed away from his wounds. He was just 22 years old. The news spread quickly throughout Iraq. His squad began carrying a piece of his gear with them on every patrol, a silent reminder of their brother who had given everything. At his funeral, hundreds of Marines, veterans, and locals lined the small town streets. But Dunham's story wasn't over. It was just beginning to echo. Corporal Jason Dunham's act of courage rippled far beyond that street in Karabila. He was young, fearless, and loyal, a Marine who made a choice in less than a heartbeat that would define him forever. 3 years later, in 2007, President George W. Bush awarded him the Medal of Honor, the first Marine to receive it for actions in the Iraq War. At the White House, his parents stood proudly as the citation was read aloud. His undaunted courage and complete disregard for his own safety saved the lives of at least 2 fellow Marines. His name now sails the world on the USS Jason Dunham, a Navy destroyer bearing his motto and his memory, carrying it across every ocean he never got to see. Marines still tell his story in boot camps and barracks. They use his name as a reminder of what selflessness really means, that courage isn't a word, it's a choice. Jason Dunham saw a grenade. He had a split second to make a decision, and he decided to save his brothers. That's not just heroism, that's love in its purest form. This video was created to honor Corporal Jason Dunham, a Marine who gave his life so that others could live. His courage reminds us that heroism isn't about medals or glory, it's about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. October 17th, 2005, Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cash, a platoon sergeant with the 3rd Infantry Division, led his men on what should have been a routine patrol near Samarra, Iraq. Cash's Bradley fighting vehicle rumbled down a dusty road through a quiet village. The air was heavy with heat, locals watching from the doorways. He scanned every culvert, every patch of disturbed dirt, always thinking about IEDs. He had warned his men countless times. It's the road that you think is safe that gets you. The radio was completely clear. No gunfire, no chatter, just the hum of diesel engines and the rattle of gear. And then, in an instant, that silence was gone. A massive explosion ripped through Cash's vehicle, a buried bomb lifting 30 tons of armor off the ground and engulfing it in flames. Within seconds, fire and fuel swallowed the Bradley whole. Inside, soldiers screamed for help. The IED detonated directly beneath Cash's Bradley, a massive blast of buried explosives designed to rip through armor. The vehicle lifted off the ground, metal screaming, fire and dust engulfing it in a single instant. Inside, the soldiers were thrown violently against steel walls. Rounds from loaded weapons began cooking off inside. Hydraulic fluid and fuel ignited. The interior became an inferno. The blast tore open the fuel cell, and in an instant, flames spread through the troop compartment. Thick, suffocating smoke began rolling out as the vehicle slid to a stop on the side of the road. Cash was the first man out. His uniform was completely soaked in fuel, and he caught fire the moment he hit open air. He dropped to the ground trying to put out the flames, but he wasn't thinking about himself. Inside, he could hear the screams of his men trapped in the back, burning alive. Then suddenly, gunfire erupted from the tree line. Small arms, sporadic but real. Insurgents were waiting, using the explosion as an ambush trigger. The convoy scrambled for cover, but Cash didn't. He turned back toward the burning Bradley. He ripped open the hatch with bare, blistered hands. A rush of heat hit him like a blast furnace. Smoke, fire, the smell of burning plastic and metal. The fuel that had drenched his uniform now burned across his body, but Cash didn't back down. He reached inside, grabbed the first soldier he could find, and dragged him out into the dirt. The man was unconscious and on fire. His gear fused to his skin. Cash rolled him over, smothering the flames with his own body. Then he got up, still burning, still on fire, and went back in for another. The soldiers who could still fight laid down suppressive fire while Cash worked. No one could believe what they were seeing. Every second inside that Bradley was lethal. Ammunition detonating, fuel exploding, temperatures high enough to melt steel. But Cash didn't stop. The fire burned hotter than anything man should stand near, a wall of heat and flame roaring out of the Bradley's open hatch. Inside, it was an oven of death. Cash was already burned head to toe, but he didn't care. All that mattered to him were the voices screaming for help from inside. The heat was so intense it warped the steel hatch. He had to wedge it open with his shoulder. He then reached in again and dragged a second man out, coughing and barely alive. Each trip cost him more. Every breath seared his lungs. Every step peeled away more and more flesh, but he didn't hesitate. Witnesses later said they could hear him through the chaos yelling, "I got you, hold on, I got you." He went back a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth. By now his hands were burned down to the muscle. His skin was gone in patches, his body blackened and smoking, but still he kept moving. One soldier later said he wasn't running on adrenaline, he was running on love for his guys. Another recalled he didn't stop to think, he didn't panic, he just went back in over and over again. The medics tried desperately to pull him away. They could see he was dying, but he refused. He ordered them to focus on the others. Even as they were loading casualties into the medevac, Cash moved between them, helping lift stretchers, directing fire teams, and giving orders. At that point, his burns covered more than 70% of his body. He should have been unconscious, but he wasn't. He was still fighting. Not the enemy, but time itself. When the medevac Black Hawk landed, Cash refused to climb on board. He pointed to his men first, insisting every one of them be evacuated before him. "I'm good," he told the medic. "Take care of my boys." He said it again and again, his voice quiet, ragged but firm. The medics finally forced him onto the last stretcher after everyone else had been loaded. But even then, he tried to sit up, reaching out towards the burning vehicle one last time. The medics assured him that everyone was out. As the helicopter lifted off, the fire behind him still raged, the smoke curling into the sky like a black monument to his courage. By the time the medevac lifted off, the flames had taken nearly everything from him. Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cash had burns over 72% of his body. His uniform had melted into his skin. The smell of smoke and fuel still clung to him even at altitude. But as the helicopter raced towards Ballard Air Base, he wasn't asking about himself. He was asking about his men. The medics recalled him repeatedly asking them, "How are my boys? Are they okay?" The medics could barely hear him over the rotors, his voice weak and labored, but every few minutes he asked the same question again. He didn't talk about his pain, he didn't ask if he was going to survive, he only asked about his men. At the airbase, doctors fought hard to stabilize him. They couldn't believe he was still conscious. His burns were so severe his internal organs were failing, yet he still tried to get up when the stretcher stopped moving. From the airbase, he was flown to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, the same hospital where the most severely burned soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan were sent. When his family arrived, they could barely recognize him, but his sister said that when she walked into the room, he still tried to smile. The first words he whispered to his family were the same ones he'd said since the explosion. "How are my boys?" Even as his body began to shut down, his mind stayed with his soldiers. Nurses recalled that when anyone mentioned his unit, his vital signs would rise, as if his heart was refusing to let go. Over the next 3 weeks, Cash's condition worsened. The burns were too deep, the infections too severe. His soldiers visited when they could, standing silently beside his bed. The man who had saved them now fighting his own battle. On November 8th, 2005, Sergeant First Class Alwyn Crindle Cash succumbed to his injuries. He was 35 years old. Tragically, along with him, 3 of the men he pulled out also passed in the hospital due to the severity of their wounds. In the days that followed, his unit struggled to process what he'd done. One of the men he pulled from the fire told reporters, "He saved my life. He was on fire the whole time, but he never gave up on me. There are no words to describe that kind of courage. At his funeral, hundreds of soldiers stood in formation under a gray Texas sky. They watched as the flag was folded and presented to his family. There wasn't a dry eye in sight. For many of the men who served with him, that day became the moment they redefined what heroism meant. No medals, no promotions, but the willingness to give everything, even your life, for the people beside you. Cash had showed them what that looked like. In war, there are moments so extraordinary that they transcend the battlefield, moments where courage itself seems to take human form. For the soldiers who served with him, Alwyn Cash was that moment. After his death, his unit, his commanders, and his family immediately began pushing for recognition. They knew what he had done. They'd seen it with their own eyes, a man who burned alive to save others. But the military bureaucracy moved slowly. His actions were first recognized with the Silver Star, the nation's third highest award for valor. Those who knew him were outraged. They said it wasn't enough. For years, fellow soldiers, journalists, and lawmakers fought to upgrade his award. One of his platoon members told Congress, "Sergeant Cash is the purest example of selfless service I have ever seen. If that doesn't earn the Medal of Honor, then nothing does." The movement grew. Veterans wrote letters, generals spoke publicly, presidents took notice. It would take 16 long years, 16 years of persistence, paperwork, and people refusing to let his name fade. And then finally, on December 16th, 2021, at the White House, President Joe Biden stood before Cash's family and said the words they had waited nearly 2 decades to hear. The story of Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cash is one of the most extraordinary acts of valor we've ever seen. As the Medal of Honor was placed into his widow's hands, the room fell silent. Many of the soldiers he'd saved were there. In that moment, Cash's story became more than just a memory. It became a message that true heroism isn't loud, it isn't reckless, it's quiet, it's selfless. It's a man walking into fire again and again because he refuses to leave anyone behind. Today, his name lives on in classrooms, in Army training centers, and the stories told by soldiers who never even met him. Fort Stewart named a building after him. Schools across his home state, Florida, honor him each year. His fellow NCOs tell new recruits about the man who burned to save his brothers. Sergeant First Class Alwyn Cash didn't die because he was fearless. He died because he refused to stop caring. When everything around him burned, when fear, pain, and chaos consumed the world around him, he chose to go back into the fire. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because his brothers were still in there. He didn't hesitate, he didn't wait for orders, he just went. In the end, he gave everything a man could give, and in doing so, he gave 6 others the chance to live. That's not courage born in training. That's not something they teach in any manual. That's love in its purest form. The kind that only exists between soldiers who've shared the same dust, the same fear, and the same promise. I won't leave you behind. Today, his name stands among legends, but to the men he saved, he'll always just be Sergeant Cash, the one who kept his word, the one who never quit. If you ever wonder what a hero truly looks like, don't look to the movies. Look to a man who walked into fire 6 times and never once looked back. Because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to love others more than yourself.